Good morning, and let us pray. Happiness cannot be found through great effort and willpower, but is already present in open relaxation and letting go. Don't strain yourself. There is nothing to do or undo. Whatever momentarily arises in the body, mind, has no real importance at all. Far better to simply let the entire game happen on its own, springing up and falling back like waves without changing or manipulating anything. Everything vanishes and reappears magically, again and again, time without end. Although peace and happiness do not exist as an actual thing or place, it is always available and accompanies you every instant. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Orders of the day. I recognize the Minister of Heritage, Sport, Tourism, and Culture Industries.
Thank you, Speaker. I'd like to move Government Order 159.
Order G159, resuming the debate adjourned on March 10th, 2020, on the motion for second reading of Bill 159, an act to amend various statutes in respect to consumer protection.
Further debate.
Further debate?
The member for Ottawa Centre.
Well, thank you, Speaker. It's an honor to rise in this House today. Not only as a member of the opposition, but I have to say as the seniors critic for this province. I know I'm only 48 years old, but one of the reasons I was very happy to be given this particular critic portfolio, Speaker, is that I was actually raised at a formative year by my grandparents and taught that it's important to listen to our elders. So I've had the great fortune as the seniors critic in the last 18 months to listen to seniors from across Ontario. One of the seniors I've had the great fortune to listen to is Bill Hillier, who lives in a neighbourhood called Cardinal Creek in the riding of Orleans. And Mr. Hillier is one of those who deputed to the travelling committee that wanted to hear from Ontarians on this Bill 159, which is intended, as I understand from my friends, to increase consumer protection. But what Mr. Hillier's story revealed to the travelling committee and revealed to the government, certainly revealed to me as seniors critic in the opposition, is that we are failing consumers. And we have been failing consumers in the home building industry since the year Tarion was created, 1976. And why is that, Speaker? And what did Mr. Hillier have to tell us about that? Well, I want to read from a news article that my colleague MPP Rakosevich for Humber River Black Creek cited in his terrific one-hour lead on this particular bill. It's revelatory because it was written in the exact same year, 1976, that Tarion was created. The author was Jacob Ziegel, a U of T professor of law, and what he wrote about Tarion when it was founded was this: the provisions in the bill are neither novel nor objectionable in principle. They are indeed widely guaranteed or regarded as necessary for the operation of a successful warranty schemes, the various things Tarion was to do. What is without precedent in Ontario consumer protection legislation is the nature of a body entrusted with the administration of important powers contained in them. For it is not the Ministry of Consumer and Commercial Relations or any government agency that is entrusted with this task. It will be a non-profit corporation of undetermined composition incorporated under the Ontario Corporations Act and at best only indirectly accountable for its actions to the legislature. There is no secrecy about the reasons for this feature of the Act. It is a surrender to the long-sought goal of HUDAC, the Housing and Urban Development Association of Canada, The association has argued for several years that warranty schemes for new homes should be administered by the builders themselves and that the construction industry should have majority representation on the corporation to be established for this purpose. In earlier discussions involving the establishment of a national home warranty scheme, the federal government refused to accede to this demand. There are strong indications the Ontario government will prove more compliant. There you have it, Speaker. On the very year that Tarion was brought into being, one of the more informed voices in Ontario was warning us, be careful. The home building industry, and we aren't impugning the whole home building industry, the vast majority of operators in that sector, some are family members of mine, are fine. But we don't let industries this significant regulate themselves. It ought to be the job of government to do that. That's what Professor Ziegel was warning us about. And to take us to the neighborhood of Cardinal Creek, to take us to Mr. Hillier's home. It was in 2017 when him and his spouse had purchased a beautiful home. I've seen it myself, beautiful from the outside. They went down to the basement because they were having people over for Christmas dinner. And they noticed an enormous pool of water in the basement. And understandably, Mr. Hillier began to ask himself, where is this water coming from? Is this a brand new home? I don't see a leak in the ceiling. I can't see any leak in the foundation of this brand new basement. But in fact, Speaker, what they found was massive ice in the walls, which then turned into mold. And Mr. Hillier, right, and hi Bill, if you're watching this, Mr. Hillier right now is living with cancer. And what's worrisome about this story, despite the fact that Mr. Hillier and his family have to go through that, as so many other families in Ontario have to go through, is that this is ominously reminiscent of another story involving Tarion. That my friend, who the former Minister for Consumer and Government Relations, MPP Walker, met with someone, if you can believe it, Speaker, who fought Tarion for 27 years. 27 years, and took his own life. And in the last moments of that life was battling with cancer. MPP Walker, to his credit, did a press conference when he committed on behalf of this government to fix Tarion, which he alleged was broken. I agree with him. He did a press conference with the spouse of that gentleman. So I guess I would say, as the seniors critic, Speaker, on behalf of not just seniors but all people in this province, we cannot allow seniors and their families to suffer. They've built this province. Everything around us, everything, every single brick in this building, every public institution we have because of grandmothers and grandfathers. But right now, what I can tell you with confidence is that someone, Mr. Hillier, is sitting in a home in Cardinal Creek which is flawed and faulty, struggling with cancer, worried about the fact that that very home may be making his health condition worse. I want us to marinate that for a second. I want that to seep in. Because I can tell you something. Mr. Howard Bogak, apologies Mr. Bogak if I mispronounce your surname, who was Tarion's CEO, in last year earned a salary of $681,000, had a car allowance of $87,000, and with the Attorney General of this province, thanks to MPP Gates, who made the point of insisting under the previous government that the Attorney General look into Tarion and fix the Tarion mess. Thank you, MPP Gates. But the Attorney General found it is not that Tarion is being weighed down by a culture of executives rewarding themselves. It is also inclined, rather like bad apples in the insurance industry, to incentivize people working for Tarion who deny claims to people like Mr. Hillier. The Attorney General found that between 2014 and 2018, Tarion refused over 9,700 requests for defects in homes to be built because the homeowners missed these tight 30-day deadlines that Tarion insists upon. 1,300 of those people, Speaker, missed that deadline by a single day, often due to delays in correspondence, not to concerns from the particular nature of the defects, the severity of the defects. I was happy because of the Canadians for Properly Built Homes, a terrific organization that's great work in this particular field that's helped Mr. Hillier and other people like him. Myself and MPP Rakosevich, we went to a large meeting in Orleans, down the road from the Cardinal Creek community, where so many homes have been improperly built. I met with so many homeowners who confided in me privately, Joel, we would love to struggle against Tarion publicly, as Mr. Hillier has done, but we're worried what that would mean to the property values of our homes. If we complain, we won't be able to sell our homes. Can you imagine, Speaker, like for the most important investment one will ever make in their life, to be put into that position? But nonetheless, there was over 200 people in that room. Mr. Hillier spoke fantastically, so did Karen Somerville. Karen, if you're watching this, thank you for all your work for justice on this file. And it really struggled. I tried to think on my way back to downtown Ottawa and later on my way back to the legislature, how do I understand this culture? What has happened? You know, what Professor Ziegel said in 1976, probably the most apt, but what has happened since? And this is difficult subject material, so I'm going to struggle for levity, if you'll allow me, Speaker, with some of my time left. I know there are some people in this House who are suffering Toronto Maple Leafs fans, and you suffered for a long time. And if there's something Toronto Maple Leafs fans understand, Speaker, it's the culture of ineptitude and self-serving nature that happened under Howard Ballard's leadership. Speaker, we're talking about an owner of a hockey team, a major crown jewel of this country, who records show charges were laid, convictions were prosecuted, not only took money for this hockey team for himself, but doled out money for limousines for his daughter's wedding, bought motorcycles for his son. Like, if you can imagine all those players, all those coaches, all those fans who for years showed up in that hockey rink supporting that team, and this is what Mr. Ballard was doing with their money, right? So Mr. Ballard gets convicted, sent to Kingston for a short stint in the Kingston pen, short, and then allowed, as he described it, motel living conditions with a television and steak dinners and photos with corrections officers. He operated with impunity, Speaker. Operated with impunity. And I would hazard a guess that despite the great work, and I'm not a Maple Leafs fan if I'm honest with you, but despite the great work of the fan base supporting that team, the coaches, the players since, they are still living under that legacy. They have not had a reckoning with that legacy. I think the same is true with Tarion. You have a corporation that for some reason was allowed to operate outside the orbit of government on probably the most important investment opportunity for consumers in this province. Some of us in this House may have personal savings and capital gains savings and whatever savings that would be larger than a house. I suspect many of us won't. The home is the biggest thing that any of us ever invest in. And we have set up since 1976 an entity which allows the home building industry, until recently, to regulate itself. The majority of the executive governing body of Tarion, until recently, was the home building industry. And that's where I'll give my friends in government some credit here. I appreciate the fact that you've changed the governing body of Tarion to reduce the impact of the home building industry having the plurality of votes there. Fine. Great. But what remains worrisome for me, Speaker, is this. We still have a situation in which Tarion as an entity is not democratically accountable to the people of Ontario. There's still a firewall between Tarion and us. And we have to ring the bell pretty hard in this place to get noticed. And the Canadians for Properly Built Homes, Mr. Hillier and others, they have to ring the bell pretty hard for us to get noticed. Now, again, I was taught, Speaker, when I went to school, it wasn't good enough if I saw injustice for me to just rail into the wind. I had to try to understand my adversary. I had to try to understand how they thought. So I'm going to give Tarion the benefit of the doubt. I can use this now, I'm told, by the standing orders. And I'm going to quote what one of their policy folks said when MPP Walker, Minister Thompson, MPP Rakosevich, MPP Gates, and others have pressed from within this place questions on their executive compensation scheme. Because it seems ridiculous on the face of it, right, Speaker, the notion that someone working for the people of Ontario should be entitled to a salary that is 3 times what the Premier of this province makes, but I digress. What Melanie Kearns said to the CBC in response to this question about executive compensation was the following. We use market salary surveys and independent external HR compensation experts to review our board and executive compensation programs, and we benchmark our compensation against Ontario's other administrative authorities as well as comparable public sector organizations, she wrote. And she went on to say, according to the CBC, that the members' compensation on the executive of Tarion is reviewed every 2 years, and with the exception of the board and committee chairs, the board's remuneration hasn't changed since 2005. So, if I'm understanding what Ms. Kearns was telling us through the CBC, the fact that executive compensation has been bloated at Tarion since 2005, the fact that $4 million was spent on its executives alone and that Mr. Bogak received over $681,000 and that has somehow been held flat for the last 14 years is supposed to satisfy Mr. Hillier, Ms. Somerville, MPP Rakosevich, MPP Gates, and others who've led this fight. All that tells me is that there has been a massive problem of outpaced compensation of Tarion executives for a long time, even if it's been not keeping pace with inflation. It's certainly not going to give Mr. Hillier any comfort, Speaker. It's not going to give right now, if you think of what, if you allow me the brief digression, Speaker, if you think of what we're going through as a province, as a country right now with the COVID-19 scare and the need for us to keep each other safe, I actually woke up this morning, my first thought was for all the food service workers in this province who, because they, right now, if they don't have the capacity to call in sick, are being compelled to go to work sick, and they could carry a lot of fear in their heart on their way to work about what they could be transmitting to us, Speaker. Fear in their heart. I'm going to make a guess, Speaker, that people working in that industry are not well compensated, probably not full-time, probably don't have benefits, don't have a lot of stake. And Ms. Kearns' assertion to us that, oh, well, we've held executive compensation relatively flat since 2005, even if our executive makes 3 times the salary of the Premier. Okay. That just shows the entitlement in this corporation. Because that's what it is. It is an entitled corporation we've allowed to develop and exist for decades. My friends in government have said it's broken. I agree. But if Tarion is broken, how is the answer allowing members of that same Tarion management team to regain control? Mr. Bogak is on his way out. But the people continuing to run the operation are part of the same Tarion bureaucracy that existed there for years. Okay, if my grandmother was here, Speaker, who I've spoken about before when you've been here, my Presbyterian grandmother, whom I love, she would say, you do not let the fox guard the hen house. You do not. You do not let people who have ripped consumers off for years and rewarded themselves retain control of a corporation that has such an important role in the lives of people in this province. That doesn't do justice to Mr. Hillier. It doesn't do justice to what is right. I want to say something else about Bill 159 because, of course, it's about much more than Tarion. And my friend MPP Rashid talked about this yesterday. Part of what this bill will do in ticket sales is ensure that commercial transactions are done in Canadian dollars. My friend MPP Rakosevich said to committee in his 1-hour lead on this issue that he brought amendments to the relevant committee on Bill 159 asking for ticket sales and resales to not exceed 50% of their advertised price. That amendment was defeated by my friends. It's not been accepted by the government. And here's what's happening to ticketed events right across this country. Indeed, from what I can tell, across the world. Scalpers and ticket originators are colluding to restrict supply of tickets. And you have situations where last year, Speaker, when our Toronto Raptors did that magnificent run on the way to the World Championship, front row court seats, which I will never be able to afford, but nonetheless, front row court seats at those games were $13,000 each. And here's the rub, Speaker. It's not only that these tickets are the province of the most wealthy folks. Get this. Because of federal tax exemptions that exist, not here, but at the federal level, some corporations and some wealthy individuals will be going to those Raptor games that have inflated ticket prices because this legislation doesn't go far enough and writing them off on all of us. The tax expenditure covers 50%. 50% of the values of the ticket, Speaker. That's what people will get to write off. Can you imagine? In a province where we have a child poverty rate, where we have 1 of 7 people, as my friend MPP McLeod often has said in the past, living in poverty, that we allow a situation where people can write off 50% of the cost of meals and entertainment expenses, like a Raptors game, a ticket that costs $13,000 because this bill doesn't go far enough. We let that happen. We let that happen in a context where, as my friend Saul Mamakwa and MPP Mamakwa has mentioned, we have boil water advisories, we have unpotable water, we have people living in abject poverty, we have a suicide crisis across Indigenous lands. And yet we let an executive write off the cost of a $13,000 ticket to a Raptors game? What is going on with us? I understand there was a prayer breakfast this morning, Speaker. I'm sad to have missed it. We got to pray for something deep. We got to pray for something really deep. If we're allowing a province where people can write off 50% of a $13,000 ticket and Indigenous kids are taking their own life, Indigenous communities do not have potable water, kids are living in poverty, I implore upon my friends in government, show some leadership in this aspect of your bill. Put that cap on the resale value of tickets. Tell the scalping, ticket-originating community, do not gouge sports fans or entertainment consumers. And absolutely don't let executives write off the cost of that and make us pay for it. That is the most egregious part of it. Speaker, send a letter to your counterparts in the federal government. Tell them the gravy train has to stop. Tell them that just because you're wealthy, you don't get to ask the rest of Ontario, who have real needs, to pay for your exaggerated lifestyles. So I just want to say in closing, Speaker, again I want to give thanks for people in this House who've carried this fight for a long time. I didn't mention MPP Rosario Marchese, who was a critic on this file for many years, MPP Gates, MPP Rakocevic. I take to heart what my friends in government have said about Tarion being broken. Fix it. Also fix the ticket industry. This is your chance. You're the ones with the reins. Use them for the wisdom of the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions? I will recognize the member from Thunder Bay, Atikokan.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you to my colleague from Ottawa Centre. When this bill was being reviewed in the Justice Committee, my colleague, the member for Humber Black Creek Black River, proposed an owner may submit a claim to the corporation at any time during the applicable warranty period and may submit one or more updates setting out unresolved defects to the corporation at any time during the applicable warranty period. Many homeowners have complained their claims were denied simply for missing the 30-day window at the beginning and end of their one-year warranties. In committee, the government members claimed that there were IT problems and talked about needing to consult more. What would be the impact of extending that deadline?
Thank you very much. Turn it back to the member from Ottawa Centre for a response.
Thank you, Speaker. I always like it when you say my riding name. You have that theatrical voice. Never lose that. I want to.
Yes, he should.
I want to say that all of these rules we've heard from consumers, Speaker. That all of these rules, including one my friend from Thunder Bay Atikokan didn't mention, which is that if a consumer misses a home visit from a Tarion representative, they're all of a sudden in default and have fallen outside of rules to allow for warranties to be covered. So these IT rules are important, and it bothers me that home builders, because it's home builders and home purchasers who by their fees allow Tarion to exist. It sits on a reserve fund of $250 million, Speaker. That's how it operates. That's how it's funded. These are rules meant to prevent against claims, often worthy claims, being brought to Tarion's executive. And I think we should be empowering consumers to seek redress.
Much. Further questions? Further question? Recognize the Minister of Heritage, Sport, Tourism, and culture industries.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I asked the member opposite. Our government has taken and acted quickly in addressing 29 recommendations from the Auditor General in the province of Ontario, a well-esteemed individual who I've had the pleasure of working with over a number of years. Again, we've acted quickly on this, and if the proposed legislation is passed, it will quickly support consumer protection in the province of Ontario. An improved warranty program will be launched in the fall of 2020. So I ask the member opposite, why is the opposition trying to stand in the way of progress, trying to stand in the way of these recommendations that the Minister of Government and Consumer Services, as well as the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, are trying to bring to consumers to protect them? I don't understand why the opposition always has to oppose. They can be critical thinkers, they can improve the piece of legislation, but why must they always oppose whatever we propose?
Thank you very much. Now I look back to the member from Ottawa Centre for response.
Well, thank you, Speaker. What I'd say back to the member is, I mean, in her place, in this place, representing our city of Ottawa, she has stood ferociously when in opposition, holding governments to accountable. That's what we're doing. We're doing our job. But here's the point. When you produce a bill that allows the majority of Tarion's executive team to stay intact, you can expect some squawking from over here, because that's what consumers have asked for. I will also say this. I would welcome an opportunity with the member to get out of Cardinal Creek, to get out of our lanes. Let's take this opportunity on the road in our city of Ottawa. Let's go to Nepean, let's go to Barhaven, let's go to Canada, let's go to places where homes are springing up like mushrooms. They're being built so fast, and owners are talking about them falling apart. So ask the consumers, is what I would say to the member who's not listening now. It's too bad, because I'm answering your question. Ask the homeowners if they're satisfied with the existing Tarion leadership being able to meet their needs. I suspect, given what we're seeing in the media, they're not. And it's our job to stand up and fight for them, and we won't apologize for doing so.
Thank you very much. Further questions? The member from Thunder Bay, Atikokan.
Thank you, Speaker. When this bill was being reviewed in the Justice Committee, my colleague, the member of Humber Black Creek Black River, proposed, no person may serve as a member on the board if at the time of the appointment they would have a real or apparent conflict of interest as defined in the regulations. Conflict of interest rules for board members make sense. I think we can all agree to that. What do you believe could be the reason that the government would not support this amendment?
Thank you. Response from the member from Ottawa Centre.
Oh, Speaker, it's so tempting when I get a question like that to go deep into partisan mode and throw words back from the previous Parliament against this government to humiliate them. But you know what? Thank you, MPP Piccini. I am better than that. So the point here is, when there is a real or apparent conflict of interest, if someone is earning their salary or has worked on a consultant on behalf of the home building industry, because there are wonderful, respectable people in that industry who I count as family members, Speaker, you got to recuse yourself from being a consumer advocate. You have to, right? Consumer protection ought to be completely indivisible. It ought to be completely available to everyone. And when your case goes to that appeal body, you have to believe that the people who are seeing this are serving no other paymaster than the rules and the better interests of the people of Ontario. But what I think the evidence has shown us is that hasn't been the case with Tarion. And my friends in government agree with that. So it's time to flush the executive team that exists at Tarion out. That's when we'll believe this is actually changing.
Thank you. Further questions? I recognize the member from Hastings, Lennox, and Addington.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can assure you on both sides of the House, we share the concern. We all hear it. Doesn't matter where you sit in this House. We have had abuse upon abuse that is certainly not acceptable. And that is why this government has moved. We've moved very, very aggressively. Now, we would all want this problem solved right tomorrow. But we do have legislation. We have processes in place that we all have to follow. And that's why with my other colleague across there, we said the real estate proposals alone were part of the solution to this. We've moved forward with the recommendations of the Auditor General. We've begun the actual process of setting up the new regulatory boards. We required the public posting of boards and executive positions. We've introduced new measures for prospective buyers and sellers, and it's a myriad of things. This is a process in action. By this fall, the new regulations and proposals should be in place, but I certainly ask the members, your advice, your counsel is certainly welcome on this, but let's be part of the solution instead of part of the problem, as we have been on all sides of this House in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. For response, back to the member from Ottawa Centre.
Thank you, Speaker. So what I will say is this. I brought up the story of Mr. Bill Hillier because he's entered into my heart. I've listened to him. It's upset me that as a senior he's had to struggle. This isn't the first time he struggled with Tarion, by the way, Speaker. If you look at the answer to what MPP Rakosevich says, he went into detail about the other 2 occasions in which he's had to engage Tarion to little success, right? I want to end with the story of Marcel and Julie Bellefeuille. They also live in Cardinal Creek. Marcel used to be the coach of the Hamilton Tiger Cats. So let me tell you something. Tarion picked on the wrong guy and the wrong woman when they picked a fight with the Bellefeuilles. I went to their home with MPP Rakosevich at their invitation, with the Ottawa media. And when you walk into their home, Speaker, you would think you're walking into a war zone. The basement was completely ripped up because radon gas was leaking up into the home. It was the builder's responsibility to put a barrier to ensure that doesn't happen. That's law. We needed to do better. And the Bellefeuilles say, change it, fix it now, completely.
Thank you very much. Further questions? I recognize the member from Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you, Speaker. I also always love hearing you say our riding name as well. My friend MPP Hardin did a beautiful job in outlining some of the issues we have in this bill. And you know what? This is actually something that was long coming. We had to fix this. We had to fix Tarion, and there was a lot of problems. So I just wanted to say, does this bill go far enough? What do you think?
Oh, well, that's a loaded...
Back to the member from Ottawa South for response.
Thank you, MPP Begum. I think you can imagine my response. No, it doesn't. And that's why, MPP Cramp, I hear you. But at the same time, I was on a story with the Bellefeuilles there. I thought I had a little bit more time, so I'll say this in my response. Marcel said that if you have a losing team in the Canadian Football League, your answer is not to retain the starting quarterback and the starting head coach or any of the coaching staff. You flush it out. You rebuild. So anything short of that is a failure in this case, Speaker. And that's what consumers are looking to you for. They want you to really tell Tarion you need not just a culture change, you need a personnel change.
Thank you very much. There is not enough time for further questions and responses. Therefore, I now turn to the member from Ottawa West Nepean for further Guelph. Forgive me. You're next in line. But I will turn to the member from Guelph for further debate.
Oh, well, thank you, Speaker. Like my colleagues, I do like the way you can uplift Guelph and make it pretty exciting on a Wednesday morning. So I rise today to speak on Bill 159, the Tarion Reform Bill. And occasionally, well, actually oftentimes, Speaker, in this House, we have an opportunity to tell the people of Ontario where we stand on issues, especially when it comes to issues of whether we're going to defend and protect the public interest or private interest. And really what Bill 159 should be is a consumer protection bill, a bill that's definitively going to say that the government of Ontario is going to stand up for consumers, is going to put the public interest ahead of special interests. Since 1976, Tarion has operated with impunity, regulating itself. And Tarion's failures have been well documented. Justice Cunningham's report, to the Auditor General's report, by consumer organizations such as Canadians for Properly Built Homes and individuals. And, I want to thank the member from Ottawa Centre for telling some of those personal stories. And in my limited time, I'm not going to go into those. But I would like to say that I had hoped that the government had fully heard all of those stories. I understand they've heard some of it, and they've made some changes, but I had hoped And I believe the people of Ontario, especially people purchasing homes, had hoped that they would have delivered the full-scale, systemic, transformative change the Justice Cunningham's report showed was needed. So this bill does tinker around the edges. It makes some improvements. It answers some of the reforms from the Auditor General, but it doesn't deliver the systemic, transformative change that Tarion so desperately needs. You know, in December of 2016, Justice Cunningham delivered his Tarion review report to the Ontario government, and I will have to say it's unfortunate the previous Liberal government failed to even act. But anyway, in effect, what the Justice said is that Tarion needs to be dismantled with a multi-provider competitive model introduced to replace it. And Bill 159 doesn't deliver on that. Speaker, the members opposite have said, what's the opposition have for a recommendation? Well, my recommended solution is what Justice Cunningham called for, a multi-provider system. This type of system works very well in other provinces. I don't see why it wouldn't work in Ontario. And I realize the Auditor General cited oversight as a possible concern, but we can create mechanisms through a Crown agency, for example, to oversee and regulate a multi-provider insurance system. And as I said, it works well in other provinces in Ontario. And so in this vein, I want to quote from Justice Cunningham's report, and I believe this quote's a bit long, but it's critically important. And I quote, "At the executive level, the structure of having the same leadership team responsible for the rules of the monopoly warranty program, financial management of the program, dispute resolution, and builder regulation will inevitably give rise to a situation where financial objectives compete with other objectives, such as consumer protection. At an operational level, there is potential for conflict when the same person receives a claim, investigates it, attempts to assist the parties in resolving the claim, and then sits in judgment of the claim if not resolved. While Tarion has worked hard to build internal controls to mitigate this conflict, I believe that current controls do not accurately respond to these challenges in a manner that can achieve the objectives outlined above. I do not believe that this problem and the challenges I've identified can be adequately addressed in the current model without significant, and I emphasize structural changes to the new home warranty sector in Ontario." Speaker, Bill 159 fails to adequately address what Justice Cunningham called for. We still have members of the Home Builders Association on the board of Tarion. It's like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. Justice Cunningham called for massive systemic changes. But here we are, Speaker, tinkering around the edges, a few little steps forward here, and I'll give the government credit, a few steps forward, absolutely, but not the changes that homeowners, home purchasers need. I want to conclude by quoting from Canadians for Properly Built Homes, who presented to committee, and I quote, and it's in regard to Bill 159, quote, "It does not go nearly far enough to provide adequate consumer protection, and it is taking far too long to address the serious issues with Tarion," end quote. Speaker, this government has a choice to make. Are they going to stand up for the public interest and consumers, or are they going to stand up for private interest and home builders? Thank you, Speaker.
Thank you very much. Questions? Questions? Recognize a member from Thunder Bay, Atikokan.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you to the member from Guelph and for his talk this morning, much of which I agreed with. Much of the current bill is in response to the Auditor General's scathing report on Tarion. And one of the things the Auditor General recommended was a review of the executive compensation that they and they reviewed the large bonuses many executives also receive. My caucus colleague proposed an amendment to cap executive compensation. When this amendment was brought to committee, the government did not support it. In committee, the government member said disclosing executive pay was enough. I don't think they're going to be embarrassed. They haven't been embarrassed for many years, obviously. As the member from Humber Creek, Black Creek said, it's not enough to know what the executive compensation is. We have to bring in a cap. We have to be fair. What does the member believe would be a fair compensation?
Thank you. Back to the member from Guelph for
Thanks.
response.
I appreciate the question from the member. And $4 million of executive bonuses is not acceptable, period. I don't think you need to be a member of provincial parliament or have a PhD in economics to understand that those types of compensation levels are completely unacceptable. So I support the amendment that the member from Humber River Black Creek put forward. We should have caps on executive bonuses. And, I'm thinking back to the trust and real estate bill when it came to committee, and I had the opportunity to work with the member from Humber River Black Creek. And in that case, the government actually listened to us and worked with us to improve the legislation, which doesn't happen very often at committee, which is why it's so unfortunate it didn't happen with Bill 159.
Thank you very much. Questions? 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 I now turn to the member from Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you to the member from Guelph for his statement on this bill. You mentioned about the recommendations as well as how extensive this bill, how extensive the response should have been. And just in your opinion, do you think this government has done enough to focus on some of the issues that we're facing, especially with putting a cap on wages, salaries, but also in terms of the suffering that a lot of people went through throughout the past many years?
Turn to the member for Guelph for response.
Yeah, I think the member for the question, and clearly this bill doesn't go far enough. I mean, it doesn't address the systemic changes that Justice Cunningham in particular called for, but also that Canadians for Properly Built Homes called for, and a lot of the individuals who have struggled for years. I mean, the stories of individuals who have struggled for years for just basic justice, basic consumer protection. And I would actually argue that it's in the best interest of the Home Builders Association themselves to ensure that the system works properly. Because when you have one bad actor treating people in an egregious way, it paints all home builders with the bad brush. And that's not right. There's a lot of good home builders in this province who do things well, and they want to make sure the system works properly because it protects them as well, their reputation,
response,
as well as consumers. So this bill clearly doesn't go far enough, and it's disappointing because this was a perfect opportunity for the government to show that they were on the side of consumers.
Thank you. Questions? The member from Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Speaker. I'd like to have some questions for the member. I listened to his remarks very carefully. I guess my biggest question is how can the member, say that the government's not moving quickly when we've begun the process of setting up the regulatory body outside of Tarion. We've required the public posting of board and executive compensation. We've introduced new measures for pre-construction condominium projects. We've taken major steps to overhaul the Tarion board, and we also passed the Trust and Real Estate Services Bill, a bill that will provide all kinds of transparency in the purchase and sale process of a home, and I'd like the member to speak to those questions.
Thank you very much. Back to the member from Guelph for response.
Yeah, so I appreciate the member's question, and I just ask the member to listen carefully to the comments I made earlier, which I clearly stated that I thought the government was moving forward and doing a few good things with this bill. They did act quickly, but the problem is they don't go far enough. So here's the opportunity to deliver systemic change. And one of the changes that Justice Cunningham called for was a multi-provider competitive model that works well in other jurisdictions. And I kind of thought the members opposite, given the fact that they're a party that generally likes competition and doesn't like government monopolies, would have actually gone for those kinds of changes. It kind of seems like it fits with the way they think about the world. But unfortunately, they didn't go that way. And I think it's because they didn't want to land on the side of consumer protection. What's the best system that would put the public interest first and protect consumers? And I think one of the things we have a responsibility to do as legislatures is look at other jurisdictions and look what works well, and then take that evidence and apply it to Ontario in order to protect consumers here in this province.
Thank you. Further questions? Recognize a member from Niagara West.
Still. Thank you very much to the member for Guelph for his presentation this morning, for speaking about this legislation, important legislation to be sure. I'm wondering if the member opposite, he references other jurisdictions when it comes to a multi-insurance provider model. I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about what some of the cost-benefit analysis has been in those jurisdictions, and if that's informed his comments this morning, if you could speak to that in a little more detail for the sake of the House and understanding just a bit more where he's coming from. I think it's valuable contributions.
Back to the member for Guelph for response.
Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to elaborate more. Thank you for the member Niagara West. So when you have a multi-provider competitive model, you move away from having a government monopoly and you actually introduce competition within the home warranty system. And in particular, you have a model that's not being overly controlled by home builders, which is what the system is supposed to regulate home builders and ensure that consumers have the best protection in place. So what that model provides, it gives consumers options. So if the government monopoly is not serving their interest, is not putting the interests of consumers first, it gives people an opportunity to select the best system that works for them. And I think that's the best way we can move forward. And it's one of the reasons I think Justice Cunningham recommended that particular model, and it's why other consumer protection groups have been recommending that model, because the government monopoly model that is predominantly been controlled by home builders, which essentially then puts, the boss in charge of the hen house, hasn't worked for consumers because it hasn't put consumer interest first and foremost.
Thank you very much. Further questions? A member from Ottawa Centre.
Thank you, Speaker. I'd ask my friend from Guelph if you wouldn't mind elaborating on the potential impacts not completely revamping Tarion might mean for green home building. Because if we allow for bad apples within the home building industry to slap them up quick and move on to the next project and have no accountability for bad building, it would seem to me, and I could be wrong, the member knows a lot about this, that those builders that take a lot of time and care into building the next generation of a suburban home, of an urban infill, of an enterprise for retail, are disincentivized. Why make that investment? It would seem to me it's a lot better, they would be led to believe by the market, to simply go with where the bad apples are going. Low cost, quick turnover, move on to the next project. Does this hurt green building? That's my question to the member.
Thank you. Back to the member for response. The member from Guelph.
Yeah, I appreciate the member's question, and absolutely an excellent point that oftentimes, the quick and cheap way of doing things may look like it's cheaper at the beginning, but it actually costs you more in the long run because your operating costs of the house, particularly to heat, cool, and light the house, is actually more expensive over time. As a matter of fact, right now I'm working with a constituent in my office who spent their entire life savings to have a highly energy efficient house that wasn't built properly. The HVAC systems are not working properly, and it's been devastating for this individual because literally it was their life savings, the home they had planned to retire in, and have it affordable because they wanted their energy costs to be low. But because of shoddy building, that's not going to happen, and it's threatened their life savings.
Thank you very much. Further debate. I recognize a member from Ottawa West. Nepean.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. It is my honor to rise once again as the member for Ottawa West Nepean and on behalf of my constituents today to contribute to the debate on Bill 159, the Rebuilding Consumer Confidence Act. Bill 159 is the next step in our government's plan to strengthen protections and promote trust and confidence for the people of Ontario. We know how important consumer confidence is to our overall economy. The people of Ontario need stronger protections because our economy works best when people have trust in the businesses, products, and services that they spend their hard-earned money on. This is true whether they are invested in one of the biggest purchases of their lifetime, a new home, or just regular things such as traveling, using an elevator, or making a purchase with their credit card. One of the key priorities of our government is to put more money back in the pockets of hardworking Ontarians. Part of putting money back in your pocket is ensuring that we are responsible with tax dollars and keep taxes low. Another critical component is making sure that proper rules are in place to protect our province's consumers. The Ontario government is strengthening protections for consumers by proposing more effective enforcement tools to address businesses that continue to cause harm to consumers. Bill 159 includes a wholesale review of the Consumer Protection Act for the first time in 15 years, Mr. Speaker. 15 years is a long time. To put it in perspective, I was 13 years old the last time that this act was reviewed, Mr. Speaker. The way that people make purchases has changed drastically in that time, especially with the rise in e-commerce over the years. Consumers now often look for products or services online using sites like Kijiji or Facebook Marketplace, which did not even exist the last time the Liberals conducted a wholesale review of the Consumer Protection Act. People were still using flip phones when the act was last overhauled. Clearly, a review is long overdue. We need to make sure that every element of the legislation works for consumers and businesses in this province. This review is being centered around holding consultations with stakeholders and consumers. These consultations will enable us to continue to implement stronger protection for the people of Ontario. Extensive consultations give an opportunity to highlight how the government is listening to ensure that we get changes right. Despite initially reviewing the Consumer Protection Act at the beginning of their mandate, this file was not treated as a priority by the former government. For the rest of their term, the Liberal government took a reactive approach to consumer protection instead of a proactive one. Updates since then were made on an ad hoc basis to address new issues in the marketplace, which sometimes led to new rules that were difficult for both businesses and consumers to understand. Calls for reform from members of the opposition and even committees that the Liberals controlled with their majority were effectively ignored. At times, this reactive approach came with severe consequences. You don't have to take my word for it, Mr. Speaker. In 2009, the Auditor General reported that the Liberal government needed to be more proactive in overseeing problem industries and repeat offenders. Although the Standing Committee on Public Accounts had recommended in 2004 that the ministry conduct a review of how well industry-sponsored oversight authorities were protecting the public, it was only after a tragic propane explosion in August 2008 that the ministry launched a comprehensive review of this area. The auditor's report described the Standing Committee's submission, stating that, and I quote, recommendations included improving communication with the public, evaluating stakeholder feedback, enhancing public education and awareness, establishing outcome-based performance measures, and improving customer services and better risk management, end quote. However, sadly,
The auditor went on to say that the ministry advised us that no further comprehensive reviews were undertaken as a result of the Standing Committee's 2004 recommendation. We do not want to wait for another tragedy to happen before we do a long-needed review of the Consumer Protection Act. I commend the Minister of Government and Consumer Services for committing to this collaborative consultation approach. By leaving consumer protection on the back burner, the Liberals eroded confidence in the government's ability to protect the consumers of the province. This was also noted in the 2009 Auditor General's report. In fact, the first recommendation regarding consumer protection called on the former government to take meaningful steps to increase public awareness of the ministry's responsibilities. And I quote here from the report, Recommendation 1, to ensure that there is adequate public awareness of the Ministry's consumer protection mandate and complaint services, the Ministry should consult with other jurisdictions that have significantly more activity and recognition by the public to see if there are any best consumer protection practices that can be applied in Ontario. They should assess its outreach and education programs with a view to identifying changes needed to make them more effective, and establish mechanisms for regularly assessing the general public's awareness of consumer rights and the Ministry's programs." End quote. These recommendations stem from findings which found that when citizens thought about who to contact about consumer complaint issues, they seldom considered going to their provincial government for assistance. The report stated, and I quote again, when asked who they would be most likely to contact if they could not resolve a consumer complaint issue with a company, respondents cited the Better Business Bureau, the legal profession, and someone in the media, all before the Government of Ontario. The failure by the Liberals had a real negative impact on consumers in Ontario. How did they specifically negatively impact consumers? Well, in many cases, protections that are offered to Ontario's consumers only work if citizens are aware of those protections. I'll come back to this point later on in my remarks. Speaker, I'd like to take a few moments now to describe the overarching framework of consumer protection in Ontario and how Bill 159 will strengthen these areas. Administrative authorities are responsible for ensuring that several laws that protect and serve Ontarians, including those that promote consumer protection, public safety, and safe retirement homes, are applied and enforced. But because they are governed by different statutes that have not been updated uniformly, there are inconsistencies. Some of the authorities are subject to relatively more or alternatively fewer requirements. In addition, some legislation governing these authorities has not kept pace with current accountability standards. In fact, one statute that governs 5 administrative authorities, the Safety and Consumer Statutes Administration Act 1996, has not been updated in over 20 years. These inconsistencies were pointed out to the Liberal government by the Auditor General more than a decade ago, as I mentioned earlier in my remarks. Our government, however, knows the importance of improved oversight and more consistent requirements for administrative authorities to ensure they deliver critical programs and services in the best interest of our citizens. We're doing that by proposing to harmonize certain key accountability, governance, and other requirements for most administrative authorities to improve the current framework to rebuild trust and accountability for the people of Ontario. I'm pleased that our government is serious about increasing transparency and accountability within administrative authorities. If passed, Bill 159 would strengthen accountability with, and I'll list them off here, Mr. Speaker, the Technical Standards and Safety Authority, the Electrical Safety Authority, Bereavement Authority of Ontario, the Real Estate Council of Ontario, the Ontario Motor Vehicle Industry Council, the Travel Industry Council of Ontario, the Condominium Authority of Ontario, the Condominium Management Regulatory Authority of Ontario, the Retirement Homes Regulatory Authority, and the Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority. These administrative authorities are each accountable to one of three different ministers: the Minister of Government and Consumer Services, the Minister of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, as well as the Minister for Seniors and Accessibility. Again, these are changes that are long overdue. This is another area that was highlighted by the Auditor General back in 2009, but again was ignored by the Liberals. And I quote, Recommendation 8, to better protect consumers and the public, the Ministry should strengthen its oversight role and accountability arrangements with designated administrative authorities, delegated authorities, by establishing formal, comprehensive accountability agreements with each delegated authority that cover financial and operational requirements that would protect the public's interests, and encouraging a more appropriate and fair balance of representation on boards of directors between governments, consumers, the public, and industry. An additional recommendation called on the former government to ensure that changes were made to allow for a comprehensive and thorough assessment of their financial and operational performance. Many of the elements of this bill that this bill are responding to are issues that have been around for years, except now the difference is we have a government that is willing to take action on them. The Rebuilding Consumer Confidence Act would increase accountability, as the bill would create more consistency regarding the ability for the Auditor General to conduct value-for-money audits of most administrative authorities. When it comes to encouraging a more appropriate and fair balance of representation on boards, that is exactly what our government is doing. One need look no further than recent changes to the board at Tarion, which is responsible for administering the Ontario New Home Warranties Plan Act. Critics have previously pointed out that they felt that developers had too much power on these boards, which is why our government has made changes to the board's composition. The Parliamentary Assistant for Government and Consumer Services, my friend, the member from Sarnia-Lambton, highlighted our balanced approach during his remarks in the Chamber last week, and I thank the member for Sarnia-Lambton for his leadership on this file. I'll quote from his remarks, "We felt that builders need to have some presence on that board if we're going to hold them accountable and get them to cooperate. We need to have them on the board and have a presence there so that we can make them react to changes we want to make. We've changed the composition so they will no longer have a majority on the board. I think that the new members will certainly get the message that this is what the minister wants. We want accountability," end quote. Additionally, the minister would be given the power to require the administrative authorities to publish compensation information on their website about board members, officers, and employees. We remain committed to the administrative authority model. However, unlike the Liberals, we will ensure that this is an accountable model, Mr. Speaker. We know that while most businesses follow the rules, there are bad actors out there that are not complying with all of them. That is why we are proposing to improve enforcement by enabling administrative monetary penalties under the Act to help deal with non-compliant businesses. We want Ontarians to know that their government is there for them. We will protect consumers and hold offenders accountable, which is a stark contrast to the previous government. As I mentioned near the beginning of my remarks, the government has a responsibility to protect consumers, especially for large purchases. The government is currently consulting on changes under the Condominium Act 1998 to help improve condo living and protect financial investments for people living in condos. More and more people are looking to condos as a housing option, and we must ensure that we protect these purchases. The consultation feedback will help with developing proposed regulatory changes to 1. Provide condo corporations with clear processes and rules for the procurement of services and goods and financial management of condo reserve funds. 2, increase the amount of interest that would be owed to a buyer by a developer on their deposits if their pre-construction condo project is cancelled and in other circumstances. 3, provide clearer processes for occupancy fees and chargebacks. 4, develop a condo guide for buyers and require developers to provide it at the point of purchase. This will better equip condo purchasers with information in an easy-to-understand format. And 5, clarify the processes for mediation or arbitration between condo corporations and owners. Speaker, we know that the province has an important role to play when it comes to consumer protection, and we will take on this role in a collaborative way. Consumers in Ontario rely on all levels of government to protect them, and that is why we will be engaging with people right across the province as we look at ways to further protect consumers. We need to work collaboratively with our federal and municipal partners. Our constituents deserve clear consumer protection rules in each and every corner of this province, whether it's in my hometown of Ottawa, in Ottawa West Nepean, all the way down to Windsor, where my grandparents are, down to your wonderful riding, or right here in downtown Toronto. We want to pool great ideas from all over Ontario to ensure that we get consumer protection right. We must ensure that whatever laws we install are brought into place with all due diligence completed, which is why we will have thorough consultations to strengthen the Consumer Protection Act. We can look to our municipal partners for positive examples of consumer protection. As an example, in 2017, Vaughan passed a bylaw to extend consumer protection coverage to include the following businesses: renovators, fence installers, pavers, landscapers, and finally, pool installers. This is all online. It is very accessible for the people of Vaughan, which is very important as well. It has been noted time and time again that consumer protection measures are only effective when the public knows about them. On the same webpage, under a section titled Consumer and Employee Protection Measures, it states the following, and I quote, "Licenses are required to undertake several consumer and employee protection measures, such as providing services in compliance with all relevant city bylaws, regulations, and related decisions, carrying a minimum of $2 million in commercial general liability insurance coverage for their work, providing a list of all relevant city bylaws and required permits to a customer in writing prior to providing a written contract," end quote. Now this is just one positive example of making rules easy to find and easy to follow. Clearly, this was not a key priority for the previous government, but it is going to be a key priority for us. In the 21st century, where we are today, Mr. Speaker, it is so critically important that we have those consumer protections that are easily accessible, that consumers can understand, so that they know about their rights, they know about their protection when they are making those critical purchases. And Mr. Speaker, this is something that I can speak to personally. As a young Ontarian, I'm hoping to be able to buy my first home in the next couple of years, and that's a daunting prospect because it's a large investment. It's probably going to be one of the largest investments I make over the course of my life, and I want to make sure that that purchase that I'm making is governed by those consumer protections, so that when I get into that new home finally, and when I have that chance to get those new keys and open that door, that new home is built to the highest standards and upholds the regulations that the people of Ontario expect us to defend here in this chamber. Speaker, as I begin to wrap up my remarks, I would like to reiterate my support for this bill. If passed, Bill 159, the Rebuilding Consumer Confidence Act, would take long overdue steps to strengthen consumer protection measures in Ontario. I once again applaud the Minister of Government and Consumer Services for her ongoing consultations with citizens and businesses across the province, and I look forward to the rest of this debate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Now it's time for questions. The member from Ottawa Centre.
Thank you, Speaker. I want to thank MPP Jeremy Roberts for his remarks. He is my neighbour, Speaker. We share a boundary. And I guess I just want to extend to the member an invitation. I would be more than willing with the member to co-host. As you mentioned, people need to know about consumer protections as they roll out. I would be more than willing to host a town hall with you on this particular matter with whatever legislation comes from this particular place, because residents in your community, residents in our community very much want to be informed. So that's an honest offer to you. I was wondering if the member could elaborate, however, on an issue that I think concerns both of us, and that is the neglect of this particular matter by the previous set of Liberal governments. I note in particular MPP Orizetti saying, while Justice Cunningham's report, the ink was barely dry, saying that he predicted that report would find Tarion's practices to be completely acceptable.
Question.
I was wondering if you thought MPP Orizetti was acting in good faith on behalf of consumers then.
Thank you. To the member from Ottawa West Nepean for response.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my friend and neighbour, the member for Ottawa Centre. I think this is definitely an issue that we need to make sure we get right for the people of Ottawa, and I look forward to working with you to make sure that we get these consumer protections right. I couldn't agree more. Again, Mr. Speaker, as I noted in my remarks, 15 years ago is when this was last updated. 15 years of neglect, of not bringing this up to the standards that the people of Ontario expect. And again, you need not look any further than the Auditor General's report back in 2009, where the Auditor General laid out some concrete steps and issues that they expected the government to take and to take action on. And I'm disappointed that it took so long for those recommendations to be acted upon. And I'm pleased that our government has had the chance to act on some of those recommendations here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions? I recognize a member from Lennox, Addington, and Hastings, Lennox, and Addington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly to the member opposite. I'm tremendously blessed and fortunate. I have a number of contractors, builders in my region, in my area, that are just absolutely wonderful. They produce a fine product. People are satisfied knowing full well that they're buying and are inhabiting the biggest purchase of their life, and it's tremendously important to them that it's done right. Regrettably, in the industry, there are bad players. We've seen that, and unfortunately, when that happens, it's such not only disappointment, but the heartache is just tremendous to all of the people who are adversely affected. I wonder, can the member tell us just how we're addressing some of those bad actors and the kind of action that this legislation is taking to prevent future malfeasance from taking place in the industry?
Thank you. Back to the member from Ottawa West Nepean for response.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my friend and colleague. You know, I agree completely with the member's comments, Mr. Speaker. I know a lot of folks who work in the home building industry who are wonderful members of the community and who do a fantastic amount of work also in the community in charitable efforts. I know I've worked with some of them on fundraising efforts for our Children's Hospital in Ottawa as just one example. But you're right, Mr. Speaker. We need to make sure that we get these consumer protections right so that people are protected when they're making some of those big, important purchases. That's why we're proposing to make the following changes to respond to consumer feedback. We're going to overhaul Ontario's new home warranties and protections program to make it more consumer-focused and reduce the role of builders. We're going to support the new consumer protection priorities that the government committed to in spring 2019 as part of the overhauled program, including enhancing the dispute resolution process and delivering new measures to promote better built homes. This is in addition to changes we have already made in the last year, such as board and executive compensation disclosure and enhancing the builder directory. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Unfortunately, there isn't enough time for further questions and responses, but it is time for member statements. I recognize the member from Willowdale.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you, Speaker. It's my privilege to rise in the House today to recognize the work, passion, and vision of a great community leader, a great friend who grew up in North York, John Gadatsis. Johnny G, as his friends call him, is a passionate textile artist who works and highlights and pays homage to Ontario's history. As part of the Canadian Tapestry and Texture Centre, Johnny G collaborates every day with Canadian artists and art professionals who share his vision of bringing Canadian stories to the forefront at home and around the world. Through their work with tapestry, Johnny G and his colleagues create lasting memorials that connect community members from across Canada with each other and to our shared history. They remind us all the importance of helping to tell Canada's magnificent story. Through exhibitions and workshops, the Canadian Tapestry and Texture Centre inspires Canadians of all ages and works to attract international textile artists to help them develop their skills needed to create beautiful tapestry. These works of arts, Mr. Speaker, can take over 450 hours to complete. Here in Ontario, we're lucky to have talented and skilled individuals like Johnny G. And so this morning, Speaker, I want to congratulate Johnny G on his continued success and thank him for supporting Ontario's arts community. Sorry I missed the reveal of your latest piece. I'll be sure to be there next time. Gigi must be very proud of you. You the man, Johnny. Thank you.
Once again, I'm going to remind members that we are currently in member statements, and I realize people are coming and going and people are catching up with each other. Please keep the private conversations as low as possible so as to allow the member to make their statement so that I can hear the member. Member statements. The next member is Toronto St. Paul's.
Speaker, one of Canada's last standing independent children's bookstores, Mabel's Fables, an iconic landmark within our Mount Pleasant